Year 12. As part of your study of British government and politics, you must study 3 election case studies. What I'm going to do is talk through one of those, and you're going to have a research task on another election. And your presentations should follow a similar format to the one that I'm going to present to you. And the main boxes to tick, the main things to cover in your presentation are to look at voting behaviour and how voting behaviour changes over time, the influence of the media, the influence of party policies on the result, of manifestos on the result, campaigns and leadership and the influence they have on the results of the election, the influence of the election result on policy afterwards, so how the election result has impacted a party's ability once in government to bring policy about, and then finally the effects of the electoral system on the resulting government as well. So how first past the post affects the result overall. So I'm going to look with you at the 2017 election, which is the first of 2 Brexit elections. This is coming just 1 year after the referendum. Theresa May replaced David Cameron as Prime Minister. She eventually stood unopposed, in a similar way to in which Rishi Sunak did in 2022. So before the final ballot is held, Andrea Leadsom drops out, which means that Theresa May is the only candidate left in the race. She is Prime Minister. She has a majority, but she thinks that the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, is in a sufficiently weak position that she can achieve a strong Conservative Party majority in the House of Commons, which will enable her to do a range of things, most of all, achieve a Brexit deal that will satisfy the Conservative Party. So this is a snap election. This wasn't supposed to happen. Britain wasn't due an election until 2020, but Theresa May famously goes on a walk up Snowdonia with her husband, and on that walk decides that the time is right for the country to have an election. So let's look at voting behaviour, and it is absolutely clear that the most important voting behaviour factor in the 2017 election is age. Now, in the 1970s, a person by the name of Pulitzer once said, class is the basis of all British party politics, all else is embellishment and detail. So in the 1970s, you could tell pretty much how somebody was going to vote based on their social class. Now, there was this phenomenon known as the working class Conservative, but by and large, the working class voted Labour and the middle class voted Tory. Nowadays, because class boundaries have changed, and the class system in Britain isn't as simple as it was certainly 100 years ago, different factors come into play. And in 2017, the clearest indicator of how somebody was going to vote was their age. All of this information, by the way, is from YouGov. So, in 2017, for every 10 years a person aged, they became 9 percentage points more likely to vote Conservative. So people under the age of 47 were more likely to vote Labour. The crossover age was 47, and then beyond that, you became more likely to be a Conservative. And every 10 years a person aged, they became 9 percentage points more likely to vote Conservative rather than Labour. And you can see that relationship is clear on the second graphic on the top right. Of people voting for the first time, 18 to 19-year-olds, because remember, 20-year-olds got the opportunity in 2015, people voting for the first time were aged between 18 and 19. 2/3 of those, 66%, voted Labour, only 19% voted Conservative. And you can see that as we work our way through the age groups, older voters are more likely to be Conservative. Voters aged 70 plus, 69% Conservative, 19% Labour. If we look at the smaller parties, we can see the Lib Dems are pretty much consistent regardless of a person's age. And we can see that there is a trend growing for UKIP. You can see that the purple bar is really relatively small up until we get to 40 years plus. And the biggest vote share was those aged between 50 and 60 years old. 3% of those voters voted UKIP. And it's not just how these people are voting that's important, it's how likely they are to vote in the first place. You can see that the average turnout in the bottom graphic across the whole country was 69%. Only voters aged 50 plus were more likely than the national average to vote. So the voters most likely to cast a ballot are those aged 70 plus. 84% of eligible voters aged 70 plus voted. And that is why older voters are so crucial to the Conservative Party, because they are loyal to the party and they are likely to turn out and vote. What we're going to see in 2017 is a couple of policies that were seen to be taking older voters, taking advantage of them or taking them for granted. And you might argue that it has a minor effect on the popularity of the party. But you can see, even though those policies weren't always friendly towards older voters, they're still strikingly more likely to vote Conservative than any other party. So that's class covered. As you can see, there are other factors to consider. Pulitzer said in the 70s that class was the only indicator somebody needed to figure out how a person was going to vote. But in today's politics, in today's Britain, there are two problems. Number one, that rule doesn't apply anymore. And number two, class boundaries just aren't as clear as they used to be. So in the top left, we can see on the top left, we can see vote by socio-economic grade. So historically, social class has been split up into 4 categories: DE, C2, C1 and AB. DE voters are the unemployed, self-employed and part-time employed. C2 voters are what we call blue-collar workers. The phrase that was used historically is quite unhelpful, and it would be referred to as unskilled labour, or blue-collar workers, because historically workers would wear overalls to work. Then in C1, you've got your so-called skilled labour or white-collar workers, and again, because you would wear a white-collared shirt to work for those sorts of jobs. And then finally in AB is professional and management positions. As I said, in today's society, those rigid social classes don't really exist like they used to. And so looking at class as an indication of voting behaviour isn't as reliable as it used to be. But you can see a trend of sorts. The Conservative Party lead with voters in AB and C2. And I think part of that is the Brexit factor, because there was a significant percentage of white working class voters supportive of Brexit, and that saw a lot of voters move to the Conservatives, sometimes for the first time. So I think that might explain why the Conservatives led with C2 voters, and the AB class remained with what their so-called natural class party, the Tories, because they have an 8-point lead there. Labour led with DE voters, and again, historically we shouldn't be surprised at that, but had a 2% lead with C1. I think what's interesting for me in all of this is that the Liberal Democrats become more popular as we move up the social classes. However, I don't think that we can really rely on social class in the way that we used to. So let's look at some other factors. If we look at the top right, education level is an interesting one. So in 2017, the more educated you were in terms of a formal education, the more likely you were to vote Labour. So we can see there, with GCSE or below qualifications, the Conservatives led by 22%. And then medium is anything between GCSEs and a degree, so that's any sort of form of further education. So A-levels would apply to that. And the Conservatives led by just 5%. And then those with a degree or above led by 17%. So you can see that there is a clear trend there between education level and voting behaviour. And again, you can see with the Liberal Democrats, as you move up the social classes, there's a trend, but also as you move up education level, the Liberal Democrats become more popular with voters. Employment status is an interesting one. You can see the huge lead that the Conservatives have with retired voters, and that is linked to age-based voting behaviour. But also, historically, the Conservatives are seen as the party most committed to retired citizens. Now, there's going to be a controversial policy that we talk about, which goes against that idea. But you can see what's interesting. Whether working part-time or full-time, not working, other forms of employment, unemployment and full-time student, Labour led with every one of those groups in some form of work or education, or the unemployed. The only group based on employment status that the Conservatives led with were retired voters. And then finally, newspaper readership. And the three that I really want to focus on are the Daily Mail, the Sun, and finally, the Times. Because all three of those are the three most read newspapers in the country, or they certainly were in 2017. What we've found in recent years with the growth of newspapers online is that these papers are becoming increasingly reluctant to share their readership figures, because I think that they're plummeting, and out of embarrassment these companies don't want to tell the world how few people are reading them, because the online news media has become far more important. But the three most read newspapers, the three most sold newspapers in the country in 2017 were all pro-Conservative and all returned Conservative majorities. The most Conservative newspaper was The Telegraph. Unsurprisingly, the most Labour voting newspaper reader was a Guardian reader, 73%. But you can see that the Conservatives had a very healthy lead with readers of the Mail, the Sun and the Times. And we're going to look in particular later on at how the Mail and the Sun tried to influence its readers and how they should vote. So let's talk about the role that the media played. This election was almost like a presidential election in the United States. It was all about the two leaders. Theresa May deliberately wanted it to be so. She wanted it to be about her up against Jeremy Corbyn, and the Conservative Party line that you kept hearing throughout the campaign was a coalition of chaos led by Jeremy Corbyn or strong and stable government led by Theresa May. And the Conservatives were basically telling the electorate, if you vote for Labour, Labour won't win enough seats to form a majority government, and so they'll have to go into a coalition with the SNP, the Lib Dems, the Greens, possibly all three. And so they referred to a coalition of chaos. They feared that the SNP coming into coalition would lead to Scottish independence. And in British political culture, we don't necessarily look on coalition governments favourably. Generally in Britain, we like to think of one-party government as strong, stable government. So Theresa May kept going back on that phrase, strong and stable. And she made it about her versus Corbyn. Do you want me or Jeremy Corbyn to be your Prime Minister? And you can see in table number 1, that information, by the way, is from research done by Bournemouth University after the election. In table number 1, it says that Theresa May was the most talked about politician, 30%, Jeremy Corbyn, 27%. After that, we've got Tim Farron down as 7%, Nicola Sturgeon, who was the leader of the Lib Dems, Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the SNP, just 4%. Then after that, we've got Boris Johnson, prominent Conservative politician, John McDonnell, the Labour Chancellor. So then we're starting to see some prominent politicians who aren't party leaders pop up. What's interesting, I think, is that a lot of the coverage of Jeremy Corbyn was negative, particularly in the right-wing press. Theresa May generally had a more favourable outlook, according to the press, but that's not necessarily the case in newspapers like the Daily Mirror. So the most prominent issues in the news process, it said the electoral process covered 33%, and I think that's because of that focusing on the so-called coalition of chaos and the strong and stable government under Theresa May. The most covered story in the news coverage was that this election was designed to give Theresa May a majority to rule. Brexit only made up 11% of stories, and I think that's necessarily because the country was still reeling from the result and coming to terms with what Brexit actually meant. Because at this time, Theresa May, when asked about Brexit, her response was, Brexit means Brexit. And she was being asked, do you want a hard Brexit, which is leaving the single market altogether, or a soft Brexit, do you want to remain in the single market and customs union? And Theresa May said, I want a red, white and blue Brexit. And she was being very vague with the details. And by saying a red, white and blue Brexit, she was trying to say, I'll do what's right for the British people, without really giving us much information of what that meant. Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit was a difficult one because historically he had been in favour of leaving the European Union. He very lukewarmly supported the Remain campaign in 2016, and Corbyn was stuck between his own personal views of being a Eurosceptic and knowing that his traditional support on the left of the Labour Party was pro-Brexit. Whereas he also knew that if he came out as such, he wouldn't win over Remain voting Conservatives and he would lose them to the Liberal Democrats. So his position on Brexit was uncertain. What you can see there are some of the key newspaper headlines of the time. We'll look at the left-wing newspaper first. For the many, not the few. So the Mirror was quoting Labour's election manifesto, lies, damned lies, and Theresa May. But generally, Theresa May, at the start of the campaign, had a favourable media outlook. As she appeared more and more on television, in interviews, and wasn't giving satisfactory answers to questions, people referred to her as the Maybot, because she wasn't able to come across in a natural way, in the way that politicians like Tony Blair and David Cameron had been able to. Okay, let's look at the Sun. We've had enough of Jezza's rubbish, vote Tory, don't let him chuck Britain in the coal bin. And then let's look at this one, Jezza's jihadi comrades. I think this relates back to a speech given by Jeremy Corbyn some years ago, in which he referred to friends from Hamas who had arrived at a memorial where he was giving a speech, and people took that word friends to say that Jeremy Corbyn sympathised with terrorists. And then you can see there the Daily Mail, apologists for terror. They also went with the they also went with that approach of attacking Jeremy Corbyn. And you can see also there John McDonnell and Diane Abbott. And Diane Abbott was someone who came in for a huge amount of abuse, much of it racist in nature, during the campaign. Now, when I say racist abuse directed at Diane Abbott, it wasn't by necessarily her other politicians. A lot of it was done on Twitter. And it says that the Mail accused these three politicians of befriending Britain's enemies. And so what we see here is the attempt by the right-wing press to make the Labour Party out to be terrorist sympathisers and unpatriotic. And so the coverage of Corbyn, particularly in the press, was often always negative, certainly in the right-wing press. Okay, let's look at the influence of party policies. The Conservative Party, despite the fact that they are hugely popular with older voters, decided to scrap the triple lock-on pensions, and that's something that reared its ugly head in 2002 in the election as well. The triple lock is a guarantee that a state pension will rise by a minimum of three things. First of all, 2.5%, or inflation, or average earnings. So your state pension will go up by a minimum of 2%, but if inflation's higher, it will go up in line with inflation, and if average earnings are higher than inflation, it will go up in line with average earnings, so that pensioners aren't getting poorer compared with those in work comparatively. You will have seen in 2022, as inflation went through the roof, there was an attempt by the Conservative government to at least consider removing the triple lock. And I think what's happened is obviously we've got an ageing population, and the retired population of the country is getting bigger. Pensions is a huge state benefit, and it's an increasing problem for the Treasury to deal with, because we've got a political culture, particularly within the Conservative Party and on the right of politics, this concept that tax is bad, that we need a low tax economy. But then we've got this huge state benefit in the form of pensions. So the Conservatives in 2017 tried to scrap the triple lock, and that went down very badly and led to a U-turn. The Conservatives decided to remove that promise from the manifesto. So there was also a plan to means test winter fuel payments. So wealthier pensioners would have lost £300 a year to help them pay their winter fuel bills, because they were deemed well off enough to afford them. And so it's strange that we've got these policies that seem to be not in the interests of the most loyal group of voters to the Conservative Party, which is older voters and the retired. We've also got this so-called dementia tax. So, prior to the 2017 election, the first £23,000 of social care that you paid for was provided by the state. Then after that £23,000, you yourself or your family had to stump up to pay towards it. What the Conservative Party decided to do was increase that to £100,000. So you wouldn't pay any social care until you'd reach that £100,000 limit. But the value of somebody's home would have been taken into account. And so what it meant is that people who needed round-the-clock care, like dementia sufferers, would be paying for their care right the way through the year. If they lived in a house that was worth over £100,000, and the average house price in this country is well above that, and it was in 2017, they would be paying for all of their social care, because that £100,000 would have been covered by the value of their home. And it became known as the dementia tax, because the people that required round-the-clock care, like dementia sufferers, would have been paying for all their social care. And it does add up for those people and their families. Other policies that were offered that weren't seemed to be aimed at older voters. They wanted to scrap free school lunches for infants in England and offer free breakfasts in all primary years instead. And then finally, another policy that the Conservatives had promoted all the way since 2010 and failed to do in every year since 2010. In 2015, they promised it again, and again in 2017, they promised to get net migration below 100,000 people. So the influence, it didn't really have an effect, despite the fact that the dementia tax was used as a stick to beat Theresa May with, and to say that she was U-turning on a policy before the election had even happened. Older voters were still as loyal to the Conservatives as ever before. And part of that is the collapse of the UKIP vote. Those older voters that voted UKIP in 2015, post-Brexit, UKIP had served a purpose. It had done what it needed to do. Britain had left the European Union thanks to the referendum, and these older voters went back to the Conservative Party. So despite those policies, which seemed to not be in the interests of older voters, they remained loyal to the Conservatives. Okay, let's have a look at what the Labour Party was promising to voters in 2017. This was Jeremy Corbyn's first general election. Labour had taken a big move out to the left, and people were expecting some more radical policies than certainly they'd seen under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and that's what they got. So first of all, the 45% threshold for paying tax was proposed to be reduced from £150,000 to £80,000. Now that does not mean that somebody who earns £80,000 pays 45% in income tax. That means that anything earned above £80,000 in a financial year is taxed at 45%. The Labour Party planned a 50% tax rate for those earning over £123,000. And again, this doesn't mean that anyone who earns that in a year pays 50% in tax on all of their earnings. It's on earnings above £123,000. So, if you've got someone who earns £125,000, they would pay 50% income tax on that £2,000 above the threshold. If you're a Premier League footballer and you're earning £200,000 a week, you are going to be paying 50% on the vast majority of your income, according to this new Labour plan. Corporation tax is a tax paid by businesses and corporations, and Labour planned to raise that to 26%, which would have brought corporation tax in line with some other European countries, but from a British perspective, it was a significant rise. Labour also planned to bring the railways back into public ownership, to renationalise the railways. They planned to abolish tuition fees and reintroduce maintenance grants for university students that came from less advantaged households. And finally, a commitment to address the home shortage in this country by building 1 million affordable homes and 100,000 council properties. So you can see that the Labour Party is going along with this phrase, for the many, not the few. The idea is that the very wealthy at the top of the society will pay more tax, and here is what we will do with the money that comes from those tax rises. And even though the Labour Party was criticised for these policies, the one thing that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott kept saying to the electorate in interviews and on the television was, this is a fully costed manifesto. And what they meant was, everything that we are going to pay for is going to come from these tax rises. Influence of party politics. Well, you would say that these traditional socialist policies would attract the working class, but we didn't really get that. We saw how class-based voting wasn't really a clear indication, and particularly up in the north, white working class northerners were less likely to get on board with the Corbyn project compared with voters in London and in the south. Now, Labour was seen as the party of young people. Youth turnout rose 15% from 2015, and that is partly down to the Jeremy Corbyn factor. Corbyn was much more popular with younger than older voters, appearing at Glastonbury on stage, but also being the first party leader to get a Snapchat account. His campaign was very much geared at a youth revolution in politics. And young turnout, although it was lower than other age groups, was quite remarkable in 2017. We'll have a quick look at the manifestos because we've already looked at policies. So Labour's manifesto was called for the many, not the few. What's remarkable about the Labour manifesto is that it leaked a week before the official release. And that meant that voters were primed for these policies, and it sort of reduced the shock factor of those policies when they were announced. And it also meant that the Labour Party in that week gained a lot more media attention for those policies. And what it meant was, in that time, people had stopped talking about Jeremy Corbyn and his personal qualities and started talking about Labour policies. And so it was a smart move for whoever decided to leak the Labour manifesto, because it took the attention away from Corbyn and more towards Labour's policies. And also it meant that Labour got a sort of a head on the Conservatives. The Conservatives released their manifesto called Forward Together a week after Labour's leaked manifesto, and it was much criticised for ambiguous wording, and the Labour Party reminded voters that their manifesto was costed and the Conservative one was not. Their top priority, as they said, was Brexit and beyond. And again, the ambiguity of what exactly Theresa May had planned for Brexit was something that she was criticised for. The longer the campaign went on, the more May's public profile was damaged. She was in a very strong position at the start of the campaign, but her performances out on the campaign trail and also the ambiguity concerning Brexit meant that her public perception, or the public's perception of her, reduced significantly. We'll talk very briefly now about the leaders and their impact on the campaigns. I'd say that the Labour Party campaign was about Jeremy Corbyn. He was initially seen as a liability, but his personable approach resonated with voters. You've got to remember that this is before the anti-Semitism scandal had begun to rock the party. And what people saw from Jeremy Corbyn was an everyday man, someone who wasn't your typical politician. He wasn't a sort of a career politician working his way through the ranks. This had been someone who'd been a backbench MP since the 1980s and was seen to represent traditional left-wing Labour values. His use of social media was ahead of its time. Now in 2022, we see politicians using it, but really Jeremy Corbyn, his use of Twitter, his use of Snapchat, really captured the imaginations of younger voters. And also, Snapchat was a good way of free advertising. It meant that you didn't have to spend huge amounts of money campaigning with things like election posters, because if you can get people following your Snapchat account, you're getting the information out there for free. One thing that Corbyn was criticised for is he held a lot of mass rallies as part of his campaign in safe seats, places like Middlesbrough. And people were saying at the time, well, that's very well and good, but how are you going to win swing voters going to safe areas of the country, talking to supporters? But Jeremy Corbyn became a celebrity. People would sing his name to the tune of Seven Nation Army by White Stripes. And he became something of a celebrity. I mean, even his appearance on Glastonbury, he became a celebrity populist politician as a result of that. And Corbyn's message, because he didn't really have an answer on Brexit, was here is how we're going to remove austerity. We're going to tax the wealthier more. We're going to spend more on public infrastructure. We're going to spend more providing support for universities, and we're going to reverse years of austerity under the Conservative Party. He was trying to move away from Brexit because his position was unclear on Brexit. And his attempt was to make the campaign a positive one for the many, not the few. He was talking about how his campaign suited the majority of British citizens. So he tried to turn it into a positive campaign. Let's talk now about Theresa May. It was all about her. It was a little bit like a presidential election in the United States. A lot of people are talking about a vote for Theresa May and her team rather than a vote for the Conservative Party. And she targeted swing seats. Her campaign began at Walmsley Primary School in Bolton North East. That was the speech where the Conservative campaign kicked off. And she was targeting those seats that were currently held by Labour that she felt she could win. Just as a note here, the Tories didn't get Bolton North East in 2017, but they did manage to take it in 2019 when Mark Logan defeated Sir David Crosby. Theresa May's speeches were very tightly controlled, and she was criticised for handpicking certain journalists from certain newspapers that were favourable to her, and the audiences were handpicked. This led to quite an embarrassing speech that she gave in Wales after the day after the so-called dementia tax was U-turned, and it led Theresa May to sort of lose her patience a little bit. She shook her head during the journalist's question and repeated the line, "Nothing has changed, nothing has changed." And it seemed to be a politician that was losing their control. But I must say, there is an element of sexism in our politics. When female politicians behave as such, and it happened with Margaret Thatcher, they're criticised for losing their patience. And it goes back to this, sexist ideal of the hysterical woman. We've seen male politicians lose their temper time and time again, and it's very rare that someone would say that someone has lost control of their emotions. So there was a subtle element of sexism to the criticism of Theresa May in that sense. The key issue for Theresa May was Brexit. Even though she wasn't clear on it, Brexit means Brexit, vote for us and we'll make it happen. She wasn't giving much away in terms of the details, but she was trying to tell the British people that the Conservatives were the only party that could be trusted with it. And again, kept referring to that message, strong and stable. The concept that Jeremy Corbyn would lead the country into chaos, strong and stable government under Theresa May. Please remember that phrase for when we get round to the actual result, strong and stable, because that is not what is delivered. And again, that strong and stable message was a negative message, because it's not vote for us for stability. It was don't vote for the alternative because it will lead to chaos. So it was a negative campaign aimed at targeting the reputation of the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn. So let's look at the results. The Conservative Party lost their majority in the House of Commons. They didn't have much of a majority to begin with, and that's why Theresa May wanted to hold this snap election. The Tories lost 12 seats overall, the Labour Party gained 29, and the SNP lost 21 as well. So even though the Conservatives were the most popular party and the biggest party in the House of Commons, they did not have a majority. You can see that they received 42% of the vote and Labour 40%. So we absolutely get a two-party system. The Tory vote share rose by 5.5%. The Labour vote share jumped by 9.5%. And again, you've got to remember that this is the 2017 Jeremy Corbyn, not the 2019 Jeremy Corbyn. 2 years later, he's going to lead Labour into its most disastrous election result since before the Second World War. But his star is on the rise at this point. Voters are increasingly turning to him and his message, because this is before the anti-Semitism crisis. I should say scandal there, really, shouldn't I? The anti-Semitism scandal hits the Labour Party. The biggest losers in the election, you can see, were UKIP. Their vote share dropped by 10.8%. Voters who voted UKIP and then got what they wanted, meaning Brexit, moved over mostly to the Conservative Party. So what did the Tories do without a majority? Well, they were officially, they were 12 seats short. But because Sinn Féin won 7 seats, that chipped away at the majority. So they only really needed 8 MPs. And they turned to the Democratic Unionists, the pro-Brexit, socially right-wing party of Northern Ireland, and their 10 MPs. Now, it would not have been a good idea for Theresa May to go into a formal coalition with the DUP, because she spent the whole campaign talking about Jeremy Corbyn in a coalition of chaos. She kept saying that she would provide strong and stable government. And so what she did, rather than enter a formal coalition, is she agreed a so-called supply and confidence deal. And that meant that for the DUP's loyalty on matters deemed confidence in the government, so key votes, the DUP MPs would vote in line with the Conservatives. In return for that, the Conservative Party pledged £1 billion worth of funding for the people of Northern Ireland. Because we get a two-party result and 82% of the vote share for the Conservatives, we get the underrepresentation of third parties. The SNP lose 21 seats, UKIP's vote share drops by 11%. So we see the underrepresentation of third parties as a result of the Conservatives and Labour Party providing us with a two-party system. Now, usually we think that a government will lose a majority if there is a large third party chipping away at their vote. That's what the Brexit Party tried to do in 2019. They tried to stop the Labour Party winning by putting candidates up in Labour voting leave areas, and the Brexit Party were relatively successful in that. But actually, this failure to get a majority government is a result of two-party voting, is a result of voters flocking to the Conservative and Labour parties rather than third parties. And a lot of those seats in Scotland that were lost were seats that went to the Conservatives by unionist voters, people living in Scotland who were in favour of Brexit and remaining in the United Kingdom, because the SNP were pro-independence and pro-Europe. And so what we see is the SNP losing seats and the Conservatives gaining them in Scotland, Labour gaining seats in England. And very quickly, I'm going to talk to you about the deviation from proportionality. which parties did better than expected and which parties did not. So the Conservative Party, even though they fell short of a majority, their deviation from proportionality was 6%. The Tories got 6% more seats in the House of Commons than they did popular vote. Despite Labour's vote share rising by nearly 10%, actually, they got 40% of the vote and 40.1% of the seats. So Labour were almost completely proportionally represented. The biggest losers, as always, were the Lib Dems, 7.4% of the vote, which was a disastrous result anyway, but less than 2% of the seats won. They were down to 8 MPs in total. The Greens and UKIP and the Lib Dems, these third parties who get support around the country that don't tend to win in constituencies, had a negative deviation from proportionality, meaning they got less seats than vote share. The SNP, the DUP and Sinn Féin are also smaller parties, but because their support is concentrated in certain areas, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they actually got more seats than their vote share nationally. So, final slide, the impact of the election on policy. When a government has a huge majority, it basically has free rein to introduce whatever it wishes because it has the MPs in the Commons to vote it through. Losing the majority for Theresa May meant that the Conservatives really had to scale back their demands. So there were policies on re-legalising fox hunting, which the Conservatives had to drop. They wanted to reintroduce grammar schools, which the Conservative Party then dropped. And they had to drop what they were planning, a change to removing free school meals, as we looked at when we looked at party policies. So there was a lot of policies from the manifesto that were dropped. And one policy that was brought in that was never expected was the government's commitment to £1 billion of funding for the people of Northern Ireland. 850 million in the first 2 years. So that was a policy that nobody expected that was brought around. And then U-turns. Usually U-turns come once a party is in government. But the key U-turn in 2017 came during the campaign itself, the so-called dementia tax. It was announced in the manifesto and it was removed as a result of the media circus that followed the announcement of this policy. So the costs of social care would be recouped after somebody died so that a person would not have to sell their home, but social care payments would essentially wipe out somebody's, the family member's inheritance. And so that U-turn came before the election result itself, rather than once the election had been brought around. So the policies that didn't happen, the fox hunting, the grammar schools, changes, reduction in free school meals, those policies were red meat to Tory voters. They're the sort of things that Tory members, Conservative Party members, want to see happen. It's a wish list of policies. They were quietly dropped. The main one was the U-turn on dementia tax, which actually happened before the election had taken place. So there you have it. There's the 2017 election case study done. Now, the exam board tells us that one of our three has to be 1997, and one election has to be before that, and one election after that. In previous years, groups have decided to do 1979 or 1983 as examples of Thatcher's rise to power or Thatcher's defeat of a left-wing Labour Party. 97 we have to study, so there will be a group looking at that. And again, in other years, some students have thought that 2019 is a better example than 2017. But in any question, essay or 9 marks, about elections, I am expecting to see examples from the case studies. I am definitely expecting to see an example from 1997, because that is the case study that the exam board tells us we must study. So no pressure to that group who has to present on 1997, but we have to see examples of your knowledge of that case study in a 9 or 25 mark question, or indeed an extract.